So, welcome to your AMH 2020 midterm exam review. I am your host and your professor, Richard Kaserman. So, let's look at our questions. Question 1. According to the authors of our text, one of the factor in the revolutions in American industry, according in the post-Civil War era, was the technological innovations and national investments which sliced the cost of production and distribution. Naturally, this is true. Number 2, the modern corporation itself was created after the Civil War based on new state and corporation laws passed during the last 25 years of the 19th century and became a legal mechanism for any enterprise to marshal vast amounts of capital while limiting the liability of shareholders. This is false. The corporation has been in existence for about 300 years. What happened is various laws and liability issues made it so that it became the predominant form, and one change was that it became a more permanent structure rather than being a more temporary structure. But overall, due to the legal environment and several other factors and later tax advantages, it became the primary means in which capital was organized. But wasn't formed in the last 25 years. In 1859, the British naturalist Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution through natural selection, the origin of the species, and personally advocated that evolutionary theory be applied to manage and improve human populations. This is false. Darwin understood that his theory was just that, a theory. But having said that, what ended up happening was that his cousin and his nephew both pushed this as a way to manage human populations. So Charles Darwin did not advocate for his theory to be used to manage people. The bloodshed, and if I should ask you, the bloodshed inherent in the 1886 Haymarket riot caused many Americans to associate unionism with radicalism and led to the eclipse of the Knights of Labor due to their association with violence and radicalism, and temporarily ended the national movement for an 8-hour day. This is true. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show that only utilized white performers and excluded Mexican Americans, American Indians, and women from the performance. This is false. And Annie Oakley is one of the primary examples, and Sitting Bull are two of the primary examples that this is not the case. As a result of the 1890 census, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the western frontier was slowly being settled and estimated the frontier would disappear by 1915. This is false. The frontier as a line in the sand that showed that beyond this there's no defined settlement. That the 1890 census said that no longer existed in North America. As a result of the let's go on to the next one. According to the text, by 1880, approximately 400,000 men, or nearly 2.5% of the nation's entire workforce, labored in the railroad industry. This is true. The Republican Party, beginning with the Republican administration of Abraham Lincoln, as a matter of policy, joined state and local governments in granting vast subsidies consisting primarily of land grants and government bonds. This is true. The Homestead Act means that even individuals qualified. Railroads, they were largely built on land grants. According to the authors of our text, stronger and more organized labor unions were formed in order to protect the rights of a growing, more permanent labor class. This is true. After beginning with the Irish immigration, especially after the German immigration began to taper off roughly 1890, 1900, a lot of other European groups would settle in cities and get jobs with industrial concerns and were more or less became a more permanent laboring class. In the American South, segregation and Jim Crow laws became less restrictive in the 1890s and were all but eliminated by the progressive movement under the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson. False. If anything, Woodrow Wilson resegregated the civil service, which had been desegregated after the Civil War, segregated the United States Navy. Yeah, I'm good on the list. At the turn of the 20th century, immigration to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe numerically surpassed Irish and German immigration. This is true. Merchants from the United States traded with China as early as 1784. This is true. U.S. naval operations against the Spanish forces in the Philippines Islands in 1898 were strategically driven by the United States for a desire to secure a trade route with China. No, the Philippines were taken over as an afterthought following the naval victory over the Spanish Pacific Fleet by the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in 1898. The United States, I should ask you, did the United States deploy troops to China in 1900 as part of a multinational force to rescue trapped foreigners and defeat the Chinese Boxer Rebellion? This is true. Much of the inspiration for the progressive movement in the United States from 1885 to 1920, as well as a large part of its assumed moral authority, came from the evolution of the Christian-based social gospel movement, and this is very much true. One of the most influential female-centric social and political movements of the progressive era, the Women Christian Temperance Union. This is true. The 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, tells you that was probably the most influential. During the progressive era, the Nansen environmental movement was often divided between the preservationists and the conservation wings of the movement. This is true. You see this to this day. There's people who want to save large tracts of Florida, including farms and rural areas, and then there's other folks who concentrate on one little area that hasn't been touched by man, and so that's still with us, and that was true in that era too. Civil rights leaders of the progressive era, Webb Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, were nearly total agreement to improve Negro education, restore African American civil rights being curtailed in much of the United States during this period. This is false. Webb Du Bois and Booker T. Washington had very different views on how to accomplish this. Booker T. Washington believed in vocational education and lifting all the boats. So what he wanted to do was have a large amount of skilled working class and middle class blacks that had industrial type jobs and clerical jobs and so forth, whereas Webb Du Bois believed that that period called the colored community or the Negro community needed to have an educated elite, and then at some point in the nebulous future we would concentrate on raising others. But we needed this elite trained in the best schools before we could move forward. And this debate still continues within the black community to this day. No government attempt was made to regulate large businesses and corporations in the United States at the local, state, or federal level prior to this passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This is false. There had been a lot of local regulation over the years, and then that led to state regulation as corporations got bigger. By 1890, there was already some federal regulation beginning in 1883 with the railroads, and the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually one of the most significant attempts, but it was actually before the Uniform Railroad Devices Act of 1883 and some other ones. Let's see here. At the time of the entry into the United States into World War I, the Army had a comprehensive system of arsenals and warehouses which contained stockpiles of modern equipment as well as a trained cadre of reservists to speed war mobilization. This is false. The United States, for most of the war, was using French machine guns, British tanks, British and French tanks, British and French aircraft, and oh, by the way, the weapon that the majority of back then doughboys carried in, which is Army and Marines carried in France, was actually a British designed weapon which was being produced by the British and was adjusted to an American caliber. So the United States was not ready for war in any way, shape, or form. When it came to the draft, slightly over 1/3 or approximately 34% of all conscripts drafted during the First World War were rejected for military service, largely due to mental insufficiency, physical defects, or psychological issues. This is true. Today, it's even harder. I often commonly say, and it's very true, it's actually more difficult to get in the United States military than it is to get into college. Troops from the United States Army and Marine Corps units began arriving in large numbers in early 1918 and were key to thwarting the German Spring Offensive in 1918 and were critical to the success of the Allied counteroffensives during the late summer and fall of 1918. This is true. The United States joined the League of Nations following the Senate ratification of the Versailles Treaty in 1921. No, we did not. We never ratified the Versailles Treaty and never signed the Treaty of Versailles. It was not ratified due to the fact that the United States did not want a multinational force to be able to order the United States to send troops to war without an act of Congress. Warren G. Harding won the 1920 presidential election and became the 29th president of the United States by promising a return to normalcy. This is true, if you see this question. Following the elimination of wartime production and price controls, the U.S. economy immediately took off and national unemployment fell below 3%. This expansion was reflected in the farmers' bankruptcy rates, previously egregious, which fell to negligible levels in the aftermath of World War I. This is false. The United States was in an agricultural depression after World War I. This significantly affected northern Florida, where a lot of peanuts and cotton went out of production during this time and in many cases never recovered. Warren G. Harding resigned from the presidency in lieu of impeachment in 1923 due to the misconduct of his Ohio gang appointees, particularly regarding the Teapot Dome sale and replaced by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. This is false. Warren G. Harding did the honorable thing and dropped dead of a heart attack before anybody could even whisper about impeachment. We'll take a quick pause there. Alrighty then, during the course of the 1920s, two of the most culturally influential transportation icons were Henry Ford, whose Model T Ford led to the birth of the mass automobile culture, which is still with us, and Charles Lindbergh, whose transatlantic solo flight showed the future potential of air transportation, and this is true. Franklin Delano Roosevelt defeated Calvin Coolidge in the 1928 presidential election and was inaugurated as president of the United States in March of 1929. This is false. Herbert Hoover won the 1928 presidential election, was inaugurated in March of 1929, just in time to take full blame or credit, depending on how you look at it, for the stock market crash and the resulting Great Depression beginning in October of 1929. So, if I should ask you, California, Colorado, and Florida implemented border checkpoints to discourage migration and settlement of displaced farmers and agricultural workers during the Dust Bowl. This is true. They're still there. If you ever drive in or out of Florida, you'll notice the agricultural checkpoints. At one time, all cars had to stop there, and if your car was dirty, they could turn you around. Well, if you're fleeing from the Dust Bowl and you're covered with dust, guess what? You get turned around. And if you're homeless and what your total capital is what's in your gas tank, yeah, you're not going to be able to wash your car and all your goods to get into Florida. A factor triggering the Great Depression was the increasing demand in the late 1920s and 30s for durable consumer goods such as household appliances, automobiles, consumer radios, and light aircraft. False. It was the fact that we had a glut of those things and more factories were coming online due to the overheated investment thing, that you had a large amount, that basically sales were flat. At the same time, more stuff was hitting the market. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt reduced government spending and direct aid to the poor in 1933 and relied on private charity and nonprofit organizations to address individual needs for the unemployed. This is false. That was Herbert Hoover's policy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the one who implemented direct aid and many times direct hiring of unemployed people by the federal government. The United States and the British Empire entered World War II at roughly the same time. This is false. The British entered the war roughly on 1 September 1939, technically 3 September 1939. And the United States did not come in until the Japanese made an aerial tour of the naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on 7 December 1941. In that intervening several years between the time that the Europeans started rearmament in a big way in 1938 and 1941, the end of 1941 was when the United States came out of the Great Depression because we were not involved in the war, and we were basically sucking the money out of all of the Allied forces who were having to go buy equipment from us. The Roosevelt administration implemented direct employment programs for the unemployed workers and youth through the programs such as the Public Works Administration, the PWA, the Works Project Administration, the WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And that is true. If I should ask you, did Wendy Wilkie defeat Franklin Roosevelt in the 1940 presidential election due to Roosevelt's failure to end the Great Depression? This is false. Roosevelt pivoted hard away from talking about the Great Depression, started talking about being able to maintain armed neutrality and the problems over there. So in our timeline, there is no President Wilkie. One social effect of the war was the mass hiring of female labor to replace conscripted and mobilized men in business and industry, often in non-traditional roles during the period immediately prior to and during World War II. And this is true. Let's go on to some multiple choice and see how those look. The 1894 Pullman Railroad strike was triggered when workers in George Pullman's Pullman Railcar Factory struck primarily due to the fact that, and the answer is the Pullman Company cut wages by a quarter but kept rents and utilities in the company town constant. Made people really mad. According to Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party of America, socialists sought to overthrow the capitalist system and the emancipation of the working class from wage slavery. Eugene Debs will be the answer to that one. A popular derogatory term for the great financial and industrial titans of the 19th century, namely railroad operators such as Cornelius Vanderbilt, oilmen such as J.D. Rockefeller, steel magnates such as Andrew Carnegie, and bankers such as J.P. Morgan was the robber barons. The Plains Indian tribes, known as the Blank, were greatly feared by settlers and violently resisted settler encroachment on their traditional lands. You'll have the choice of the Sioux, the Comanche and Kiowa, the Cheyenne, but I would go with D. All answers are correct, or whatever that letter happens to be, because they're going to move around. According to our text, the blank industry and blank industries were key to opening the American West to economic development. That would be railroad and cattle ranching. In 1887, the Blank Act was passed to change the nature of the American Indian land ownership from a collective reservation-based system to an individual ownership model, and that would be the Dawes General Allotment Act. That's still a big deal. A lot of times if somebody's trying to prove they're of Native American descent, they have to refer back to what's called the Dawes List. And those were families that were enrolled in the Dawes General Allotment Act, and their descendants, of course, are considered Native American by the government. Though there would be occasional outbreaks of violence at almost the dawn of the 20th century, according to the authors of our text, the incident at blank in response to the Ghost Dance movement of 1890 was the last major battle massacre of the Western U.S. Indian Wars. And I would say, if I was you, I would put Wounded Knee. Like the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, that was the last major battle or massacre, depending on your point of view. Blank is considered one of the first modern American historians. His frontier thesis postulated the immigration westward and the struggles inherent in the setting for the American West had create a unique American culture notably distinct from his European roots. And that would be Frederick Jackson Turner. According to the British author and poet Rudyard Kipling's assessment, Chicago of 1889 was and he called it a huge wilderness. According to our text, the blank industry created the first great concentrations of capital and spawned the first massive corporations. And that would be the railroad industry. According to our text, blank was the most important factor that drew immigrants to the United States between 1880 and 1920, and that would be industrial capitalism, the fact there were jobs available. In 1899, the United States Secretary of State, John Hay, enunciated the McKinley administration's geopolitical, diplomatic, and trade policy regarding China as the open door policy, where everybody would be welcome. The United States acquired its first Pacific possessions as a result of the Guano Islands Act of 1956. Most of these islands were uninhabited. They were gotten free of their coaling stations. Stuff like Midway Island, Howland Island, areas like that were all part of the stuff that was taken. We didn't gain our major inhabited areas until the Spanish American War. We had been taking territory as early as 1856 under the Guano Islands Act. In an attempt to prevent European efforts to dominate or recolonize Latin American countries, the Roosevelt Colony to the Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States would intervene in order to prevent the loosening of ties to civilizations such as monetary, fiscal, or political instability. And that would be the Roosevelt Colony to the Monroe Doctrine. One of the most notable muckraking journalists of the Progressive era was, and your answer there will be was most famous novel, The Jungle, exposed a questionable process utilized in the meatpacking industry in 1906. That's Upton St. Clair. He was a socialist. He wanted to reform American industrial business. The joke about his book was it aimed for America's heart and hit America in the stomach. One of the most widely reported major industrial disasters that exposed the white of female sweatshop workers in the early 20th century was the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. There were some policy differences between the presidential administrations of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. One area of continuity was the policy of, and that would be trust busting. So the progressive movement as a whole advocated for the implementation of hygienic policies to improve all races through selective breeding and sterilization of genetically, morally, or legally unfit people. This progressive movement started as a very broad-based movement that wanted to do general reforms, and eventually got away from its Christian roots and got more into the science of the era, which included stuff like eugenics. It became more and more about improving humans through selective breeding, for want of a better term. A major cause for the United States entry into World War I was, and you have the choice of the Zimmerman Telegram, which promised Mexico the return of lands lost to the United States, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by the German Navy in 1917, anti-German sentiment due to Allied propaganda, as well as deaths of Americans in incidents such as the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. There's also a choice, all answers are correct. Your best, since I didn't ask for the proximate cause, I asked for a major cause. All those were major causes, so all answers are correct. One of the largest sources of death for U.S. soldiers during the First World War was the Spanish influenza. Disease was the largest killer of American soldiers for every war up until the Second World War. Prior to the U.S. entry into the First World War, the United States Army was conducting operations in Mexico. You're given Brazil, Mexico, Puerto Rico, or Costa Rica, and Iceland. It would be Mexico. Two guiding policies advocated by Woodrow Wilson during and after the First World War were the 14 Points and the League of Nations. To influence and maintain military morale and civilian opinion, and to ensure popular support of the war effort across the United States, the Wilson administration implemented a policy of, and you have your choice of, information control, narrative creation, and dissemination of propaganda through organs such as the Office of War Information, led by George Creel. You have newspaper censorship. You have arrest of non-conforming individuals such as peace activists, draft opponents, or resistors, war critics, immigrants, and various ethnic communities, political radicals, and other actual or potential dissidents. Then you have a choice of all answers are correct. I would choose all answers are correct on that one. After the war, after World War I, young women, often middle class, who rejected many of the traditional social mores, were more likely to work outside of the home before marriage, and tended to dress in lighter, less elaborate clothing with shorter hairstyles in previous genders, which is commonly called, four choices, I would pick flappers. Okay, so during the 1920s, blank, blank, blank was the term used to describe the diverse creative atmosphere of concepts, advocacy, and ideas present within the Black, both native and immigrant communities in and around New York City. Of course, that's the Harlem Renaissance. Of those three choices, you want to put the Harlem Renaissance. You also have the Black Nationalist Movement, African Return Movement, and Pan-African Movement. Those were small parts of the actual Harlem Renaissance. Culture of the 1920s were notable for the emergence of, and you have a choice of, more fundamentalist Christian sects, which emerged in response to the German-influenced liberal theology in mainline Protestant churches, the California-based movie industry, and the development of the full-length feature films, and the combination of more comprehensive race-based scientific segregation, as well as the emergence of the new Ku Klux Klan. All of those answers are correct, so when you get to all answers are correct, that's the one you should circle. According to our text, one of the factors that led to the increasing popularity of professional sports during the decade of the 1920s was the emergence of commercial broadcast radio as a popular form of entertainment. A major misstep of President Herbert Hoover and the Republican-dominated Congress was the passage of the blank, which raised tariffs and imported goods that had lasting domestic and internal repercussions. That would be the Smoot-Hawley Act, which raised tariffs at a time we're swimming in an excess of consumer goods, so that other countries would raise tariffs, because remember, they had reciprocal tariffs back in the day, so they'd raise theirs like we raised ours. And the U.S. is sitting on a bunch of overproduction and a glut of consumer goods we can't export. Boom. Plus, it killed our agricultural exports as well. One incident of the 1932 that was said to have demonstrated both the malevolence and inability of the federal government to effectively aid the unemployed was, and you have your choice of all answers are correct, the failure of the U.S. Senate to pass effective civil rights legislation, the passage of the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, as well as the repeal of the Volstead Act, or the dispersal of the bonus army protests by World War I veterans through the use of active duty troops and police. I'd go with the dispersal of the bonus army by protests by World War I veterans through the use of active duty troops and police. according to our text, what was the proximate cause of the end of the Great Depression world in 1940? And this was, and I would go with the industrial and manpower requirements for the rearmament due to World War II. Up till 1938, recovery was flailing. The Depression was ongoing. Suddenly, in 1939, Europe saved our butt. They started killing each other, and in China as well, and China and Japan as well. Basically, unrealistic by their standards requirement for everything from radios to rifles to aircraft to ships. The United States was literally getting money from all over the world to pay for industrial goods for rearmament. One factor that caused the banking crisis during the Great Depression was, and that would be a series of bank panics caused by the failure of major banks that caused depositors to withdraw their money from local banks at once, which made these banks insolvent. The way World War II ended the United States Great Depression was Allied rearmament and the production of unimaginable amounts of war material for the Dutch, French, and British war efforts. What impact did the Great Depression had on the federal government was, and the answer will be massive increases in the federal government control of numerous aspects of the economy, industrial regulation, control, and social policy. During this presidency, Franklin Roosevelt was notable for, and the answer would be contesting and winning 4 presidential elections. Now we're going to take a quick break. Break complete. Now we're going to go to our short answer questions. In 1859, the naturalist blank published his theory of evolution through the natural selection on origin of the species, which changed the academic understanding of the natural world and exacerbated the emerging tension between scientific theory and popular contemporary Christian and Jewish religious doctrine. That will be Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is the answer. No fewer than 7,000 blank fled religious persecution and settled in the American West between 1846 and 1868, with a large concentration in and around the Utah Territory. Answer to that is the Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons. Next question will be, according to our text, the greatest strikes and other labor unrest that accompanied industrialization first hit the railroad industry. The answer will be the railroad industry, primarily because no other industry has so effectively marshaled together capital, government support, and bureaucratic management. And then next will be a question like, first organized in 1877, the Farmers Alliance attempted to restore economic leverage to farmers as they dealt with railroads, merchants, and bankers, as well as to share machinery, bargain from wholesalers, and negotiate higher prices for their crops. By 1890, this rural-based movement led to the establishment of the People's Party, better known as the Populist political party. Populist is the answer. Okay, next will be blank, aka the American blank, was a major source of sustenance for Plains Indian tribes and slowed the slaughter for hides and bones and meat, and its numbers fell from over 500,000 in the 1850s to only a few hundred remaining in the 1880s. And that would be the bison, aka the American buffalo. During the 1880s, over 1 million head of cattle were driven on cattle drives from railheads in Texas, or from Texas to railheads in Kansas. So remember, when you get to the blank at the end, railheads in blank, it's a U.S. state, that'll be Kansas. Blank is a large Midwestern city located on the shores of Lake Michigan. They became prominent in the 19th century due to its rail links and role in the U.S. meat industry, and that'll be Chicago. Chi-town. The trigger event for the blank was the destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on 15 February 1898 by an explosion of unknown origin, determined by the U.S. Navy Board to be an external explosion by a sea mine or a similar device, and that would be the Spanish-American War. Next job, President Blank, a native of Niles, Ohio, was elected in 1896 and served as President of the United States until his assassination in 1901. That'll be William McKinley. Like, McKinley, everything up on Ohio and Indiana, where the Hall of Fame games played is McKinley Stadium. You get the point. As a result of the Spanish-American War, the Blank, and as a country, acquired Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands, as well as establishing a protectorate over newly independent Cuba through agreements such as the Platt Amendment. That would be the United States. We did. We still have Guam and Puerto Rico. Philippine Islands gained independence in July of 1946, July 4th to be precise. A group of Americans who arrived in Hawaii in 1820 and China in 1830 who had outside influence on education, healthcare, and spiritual development were known as missionaries, Christian missionaries. If I should ask you, William Jennings Bryan, March 19th, 1860 to July 26th, 1925, the three-time Democratic presidential candidate, won national renown for his attack on blank. It's a monetary policy known as the gold standard. You shall not crucify man on a cross of gold, his famous speech. Upon the death of President William McKinley, Vice President blank, a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, New York City Police Commissioner, volunteer Army officer during the Cuba campaign, was inaugurated in 1901. That would be Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt. According to blank, the leader of the Socialist Party of America, socialists sought to overthrow the capitalist system and the emancipation of the working classes from wage slavery. That would be Eugene Debs again. Blank, Theodore Roosevelt's vice president and the former governor of the Philippines, was elected as president in 1908 and continued the process of breaking up monopolistic corporations and trusts. That would be William Howard Taft. I say again, William Howard Taft is the answer for that question. In a three-way race between incumbent William Howard Taft, former President Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson won the 1912 election and was inaugurated as President of the United States in March of 1913. Again, Wilson won that election. 90. President blank directed the takeover of the port of Veracruz as well as the 1916 punitive expedition against Mexico. Again, that'll be President Wilson, or President Woodrow Wilson. Blank from Ohio won the 1920 presidential election with the promise of a return to normalcy. The answer to that question is William G. Harding. While on a tour of the United States to advocate for Senate ratification of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke. The answer will be a stroke, which incapacitated him. Next will be following the death of President Warren G. Harding due to a heart attack, blank, also known as Silent Cal, took over as president. His motto was for 1924 re-election bid was keep cool with blank. Calvin Coolidge and his keep cool with Coolidge was his campaign motto. During the Great Depression, particularly the early stages, dispossessed homeless often gathered in collections of shanties and tents, popularly known as Hoovervilles, named after the president they were blaming. One of the major factors in the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 was the ongoing economic depression triggered by the stock market crash in October, commonly known as the Great Depression. A complicating factor in addressing the agricultural depression, which predated the 1929 stock market crash by several years, was the blank drought, which was which seriously impacted Oklahoma and portions of 6 adjacent states between late 1932 and 1937. Of course, that's the famous Dust Bowl. One social aspect of the was a wave of blank on homes and farms, which vastly expanded the homeless population. That would be bank foreclosures, or bank seizures also works, but bank foreclosures. Question 99. Since economic deflation, the reduction of prices for goods and services was a natural result of the removal of billions of dollars from circulation as a result of the 1929 market crash and Great Depression. One of the primary goals of eliminating the gold standard and remove the monetary gold from circulation was to devalue the U.S. dollar in order to create economic inflation. The fact that our dollar is worth about between 2.5 cents and 4 cents in dollars from that era kind of shows you how effective that was beyond their wildest dreams. And then your last normal question for 100 will be: one, an anticipated result of the New Deal restrictions placed on agricultural production, as well as the efforts to reduce the amount of land under cultivation to reduce agricultural production, was to increase the blank of sharecroppers and small farmers from the land. And that'll be eviction or displacement. Now we have some bonus questions. Should I give you those? Yeah, I should give you those. What were the dates of the United States entry into the First World War and when date did the war end? We went into the war on April 6, 1917, and we left the war on 11 November, 1918. If 11 November sounds familiar, that's presently Veterans Day. That was originally called Armistice Day, and it was the day that we signed the armistice that ended the war. What 3 territories did the United States acquire directly from Spain as a result of the Spanish-American War, and which one became an independent nation in 1946? The territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, or the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, any order, of which the Philippines achieved independence on July 4th, 1946. Please contact me if you have any questions. This has been your exam review.